Juno, the project to place a British citizen in orbit, was announced to the world in June 1989. The mission, announced in joint Anglo-Soviet press conferences in Moscow and London, set out the intention to send a privately sponsored British astronaut to the Soviet Space Station MIR in 1991. 26-year-old chemist Helen Sharman would ultimately become the first Briton to orbit the Earth. But flying in space was a career path which had never before occurred to her.
I never imagined being an astronaut when I was younger, so I just did what I enjoyed, but as I didn't really know what I wanted to do at all, I was leaving my options as open as possible. Loved sciences, knew I could learn sciences more easily if I went straight into them, yet I could pick up languages later on, so decided I'll do a science. What was going to be fairly middle of the road, so I could go physical or biological, chemistry. So I was really leaving my options as open as I could. Got a job in industry after I graduated. And then I moved from my first job, which was with GEC, an electronics factory, to Mars Confectionery, which of course all the journalists loved the idea that there was this girl from Mars who goes to the stars and all the awful headlines you can imagine. But I really was just driving home from work one evening, listening to the car radio and flicking through the radio stations, trying to find something that I fancied listening to. And I tuned on to a station, I still don't know which one it was, and I caught this job advert which started out with the line, "Astronaut wanted, no experience necessary." I had to remember the phone number at the end of the advert because I was driving along, so I had to wait till I got to traffic lights and found an old petrol receipt in the bottom of the car and scribbled down the phone number. And yeah, so something that you would never expect. You know, it wasn't a career path that I followed because there had been no job for a British astronaut up till then. It was not possible for me as a Joe Public to aspire to be an astronaut until that moment. Suddenly then, yes, that was the job I really wanted.
So, what was the reaction of your family and friends when you told them that you'd applied to become the British astronaut?
I don't think I told my family straight away. The first people I had to tell were the people at work, because once I'd applied and got to the first stage where I needed to take some time off work to go for some part of the psychological tests, I did remember telling the colleague I was actually working with, and he just laughed because I think he thought I was just joking. I was not serious at all. And my boss thought it was a bit funny, but sort of stifled a smile. And my parents laughed when I told them, till they realised I was serious. I phoned up an ex-boss, actually, on the application form I had to put in a referee, and he laughed. So I mean, I never thought it was funny when I applied. I really did think it was serious. I mean, not like no fun could be had, but I actually thought it was a serious advert. Whereas when I was telling other people, they obviously thought maybe I'd got the wrong end of the stick and someone was just having me on, I think. So yeah, it was until people realised that actually it was serious, and not only was the job seriously there, but actually I might stand a bit of a chance of getting it. I think people were very much, well, there, it's bound not to happen. So, you know, don't worry, we can ignore her and she'll get back to normal in a few days' time.
What exactly were Project Juno looking for? What were the criteria that you needed to fulfil to actually get onto the shortlist?
They wanted people within a certain age, I think it was between 21 and 40 years old, some sort of technical background, so science, engineering, medicine, so some sort of ability to be able to understand the logic of the spacecraft systems and to do the experiments, because that was going to be the job of, you know, the would-be astronaut. They wanted somebody who was still practically doing stuff in their job, so that they're manually dexterous, so that some of the experiments, they could well be quite fiddly, and they didn't want bits of experiments sort of floating off in space. So those three things really, and then the ability to learn Russian. So they didn't necessarily need me to be fluent in Russian to start with, but they wanted to choose somebody who had a proven track record of learning languages. So really, those were the four criteria. So you can imagine quite vague, in that many people would fit those criteria.
There were over 12,000 applicants for the role of Britain's first astronaut. The selection process reduced this figure to initially 35, and then to a shortlist of just 4. Gordon Brooks, a Royal Navy doctor; Clive Smith, a lecturer in aeronautical engineering; Tim Mace, an Army Major who would ultimately become Helen Sharman's backup for the flight; and of course Helen Sharman herself. So you get into the final four, you go off to Moscow in November 1989. How were you treated by the Russians? What was their reaction to you?
Well, we were not really amongst normal Russians, so we were there for 2 weeks in a hospital. The idea was that the nurses there would make sure we came to no harm, and we would be taken out of the hospital on very rare occasions in a coach, so 4 of us and a load of doctors in a coach to go perhaps to Star City, which was 30 odd kilometres northeast of Moscow. But most of the time we stayed in the hospital, and all of our tests, psychological and medical tests, were done in that hospital. So very frustrating for us, because for us it was, I'd never been to Moscow before, I'd never been to Russia before, I'd never been outside Western Europe. And there I was in Moscow, not able to see St Basil's Cathedral, not able to see the Kremlin, not able to see the Russian people on the streets going into the metro. We escaped one day, the 4 of us. In fact, we used an ICN news crew, so they'd come, because the ICN was desperate to film us, and to film us in Moscow, not just in this boring old hospital. So they helped us to get out, and there we were, sort of trudging along the sort of slightly snowy streets at the beginning of November in Moscow, feeling elated just to be out of the hospital. So, a crazy thing really. There we were, 4 people, one of whom would be going to space, and we were cooped up in this hospital for 2 weeks. And of course the nurses were really cross, because had we got knocked over by a bus or slipped on the ice and broken an ankle or something, or a wrist, then they would have come into trouble. So we were probably being a bit selfish, but I say we didn't half enjoy it.
What was actually involved in the Russian selection process? How did it differ from what had actually happened to you during the selection process in the UK?
But the Russians really just wanted to confirm the results that had happened already in the UK, to back it up, I suppose, against the results that they'd had on previous experience, compare against the other cosmonauts that they'd got. There were some extra tests that they wanted, so if one test hadn't quite come out right, so I think one of us, the centrifuge, hadn't, I don't know whether there's an ECG lead that was loose, but something they hadn't got quite all the results they wanted. So I think it was Clive Smith, he had to go in the centrifuge in Star City and have that test, but he was the only one of us who did, because our tests, they'd got the results they needed from that. So really, there was a lot of waiting around. They just wanted us there so that they could sort of pick and choose. Looking back on it now, I expect they were also getting some sort of an assessment on our characters, but I think we were all reasonably similar, and would have all been quite eminently suitable, as would many of others, I have to say. And I was just very lucky that I was one of those final 4, when I think back to all the things that could have gone wrong for me along the way. But yeah, it's difficult to say really. I have to say a lot of the tests that the Russians were using, the psychological tests, were what we in Britain would have been classed as very old-fashioned, and you can't really compare a psychological test on somebody from a British culture if you can't just translate it from Russian and expect it to be comparable. So.
The media were very much on board with Project Juno right from day one. In fact, you had Professor Heinz Wolf as a member of the team, and he was very much a big media personality back in the 80s and the 90s. The final selection process in the UK was a live television broadcast which was hosted by Anne Diamond. How did the people who were actually involved in that feel about the almost sort of game show approach to the way that programme was presented?
We knew that it was going to be a media show, a media circus really. We knew that was part of what our job was going to be, because it was a commercial mission, and the idea was to gain sponsorship. So we knew that the public face of this astronaut was going to be important from the start, and that was made very clear to us. It was, I think, something that not one of us really wanted to do, but we knew that was what we had to take in order to have the chance of going into space. The TV crews, I think, by and large, did a fabulous job, and Diamond was, very professional, and she herself did a great job, given the situation that we were in. So I have nothing to say against the media itself or the people who were involved in it, but no, the whole idea and the way it was done, the 4 of us really did not feel at all comfortable, because we'd never been in front of TV crews really. We were just getting used to having our faces and names written about in the newspapers. So while part of it was a bit kind of exciting, and I must say, during the selection process, I did go out and buy the newspapers. I thought I might be in it, and I thought, look, I'm in the newspaper, because quite a novelty. By the time we got to this this media show, and you're right, it was treated a bit like a game show, and we felt a bit demeaned by that actually. We felt that while it was quite right, and I was sort of selling myself really, and so my personal details could be on the screen, that's fine, but the way it was done, it seemed to trivialise a lot of the whole meaning of it. So we'd applied because we wanted to go into space. We were all scientists of one way, shape or form, scientists, engineers, doctors, and we wanted to do experiments in space, and we wanted people to know about that, not because it's not the boring parts of it. It's also exciting just being in space, and that's fine to talk about that, but yes, we didn't want it to be quite such a trivialised show as it was. So, but we had to go through with it, and there was all sorts of sort of stresses, let's say, leading up as well. So there were contracts to be signed and lawyers to be negotiated with, and we managed to negotiate the would-be astronauts contract, but not the would-be backups contract. So so even when we went into that game show, the 5 minutes before we were actually live on air, the management of the whole mission was trying to force us to sign the astronauts' contracts, but we decided, as the four of us, that we were going to refuse to sign that until the backups had also been agreed. So we were going to sort of stand loyally together, as it were. So we'd gone into this media show sort of 5 minutes before, having just come out of a meeting with the management, being pressurised to sign this contract, and there we were in all the sort of spotlights. And actually also with our families. So if you can imagine, the management had invited our families, I'm not against our wishes, but without us really being part of that. I hadn't seen my family for quite a few weeks, and there they were suddenly, but with me in front of what could be 5.5 million viewers, as it turned out. So all very odd. So you want to be friendly to them, but I felt really very awkward as well in front of a camera doing all that. And even when it was announced who was going to be selected to go to Russia, so it was myself and Timothy Mace, we happened to be sitting next to each other. Again, I don't know if that was organised or not, but as far as we were concerned, we had no idea. So we really did find out live then. And all I remember thinking was, no, okay, now I know what I've got to do. I've got to stand up and go towards Anne Diamond in the middle, and then turn around to face the audience. It wasn't, yes, I can now go into space or have the chance. I couldn't really feel that until after all of this razzmatazz has died down and everybody had gone away, and then there was just me and my family in the hotel that night, and we could just talk quite, at peace. It was then it could settle a little bit, and I could start to feel a little bit more excited. Then, of course, I realised that my sister had a very exciting event happen to her personally, which I won't talk about now because I always make sure that my family is at least kept private. But she had to keep all that quiet. She wasn't able to say, this is really exciting for me too. And I've subsequently spoken with quite a few astronauts, and how they felt that, yes, they've taken this media bit, the rough with the smooth, because they've had the exciting bit about going to space. But the families never had that choice. It's just, I don't think we recognise that quite often when we think about the famous people. It's not them that suffers really, it's their families and friends.
So yourself and Tim Mace are selected as the final two, and you return to Star City in Russia for the final training and selection process. Just talk me through what actually happened there.
We arrived in Russia at the end of November, so snow on the ground. We had a translator for 2 days, and then she left. And our Russian teacher spoke no English, and we spoke very little Russian at that point. We had 3 months really learning Russian. In at the deep end. At the time we thought it was very hard work and terrible, but actually, of course, the best way to learn it. And we learnt as much Russian after the swimming pool, talking to the other cosmonauts, as we did actually in the Russian lessons. We probably learnt more colloquial Russian, so then our teacher had to correct what we'd just learned the night before. But it was a question really of getting into the swing of it, I suppose. So learning the language, because all the lessons were going to be in Russian. We had to be fluent enough so that if there was an emergency in space, everything was going to be in Russian. We had to converse with mission control in Russian. So it was basically language and physical training for 3 months. And then we got we got to do astronavigation. So that was then when we really started to feel like it was a little bit more akin to what we might be doing longer term. But a lot of theory, actually, so a lot of ballistics theory. They really wanted us to get a grounding in the knowledge so that we could use the instruments properly. Very much so. We've just fitted into part of this international cosmonauts program that the Russians have had going for many, many years their Intercosmos program where they flew compatriot people from different communist countries. So they just adapted that for us, really. A month or two before we had arrived, they'd had some Japanese people from Tokyo Broadcasting Company there. And then shortly after we arrived, there was a couple of Austrians arrived as well. So we had a sort of a mini international corps, as it were, so we could cry in each other's armpits if necessary.
What were the experiments that you were actually anticipating conducting during your time on board MIR?
Well, the experiments weren't known. I mean, we knew that the idea was that sponsorship would be raised not only to fly us into space, having done the training, but to develop the experiments. So there would need to be scientists paid for and hardware bought and put together, and the whole lot. So we didn't know what experiments there were going to be at that stage. There were some ideas, really, and then they did take a pace. I mean, I'm sure some of the people who are involved now would say, actually, no, they were much more than ideas because we've been thinking about it for probably many years. So I don't wish to do them a disfavour. But really, at the beginning of the mission, there was nothing that was assured.
At what point did you and Tim Mace actually become aware that there were serious problems as far as the funding for the mission was concerned? And I mean, did you at some point think to yourself, there's a good chance this isn't actually going to happen?
Oh, it's difficult for me to say now exactly when, but I mean, really we knew all along that very little sponsorship had been raised. So I suppose it became gradually more and more apparent. I'm trying to think when it was really mooted that the experiments weren't going to happen, the British experiments weren't going to happen. Certainly I would say probably by the first summer we were there, so actually after a few months the experiments were still happening, because I came back and used some of my, we had the whole of August not in training. The typical Russians, they would, Soviet style, they would have the whole of August on holiday, as it were. They didn't have much holiday anywhere else in the year, so it was all packed into August. So I used some of that to come back to Britain and go back to Brunel University, where they were managing the experiments and to try and to gain some experience of what was going on. So it was still hoped that they would happen at that stage, but really very, very little sponsorship. So it would probably be a few months after that where we were told, look, it looks like no experiments, and at which point Tim and I both said, well, what's the point of going then? Of course we want to go into space, and of course the first British person in space, it's an important event, but there is really no point in just going to take some photographs out of the window and have a good time. It's very expensive. What a waste of resources. So we'd rather not, really. And so both Tim and I said that we'd rather just finish the whole thing. And there was then, so the management then had more discussions, and ultimately it was decided that we would be able to fly experiments, but they would be Soviet experiments. So we carried on the Soviet program, which was good for us because we did a variety. However, very sad for British science, because we could have done so much, and it could have gained. We could have then. I think it would have been much more interesting for British people to see how it was, British scientists who had been involved in that rather than Soviet scientists. So I was delighted to be able to do some small experiments for British schools, and it was really done very much on an amateur basis. A lot of teachers were involved. And a lot of people who were professionals, but they gave up their own time then for free to develop these experiments. So, for instance, we did a control experiment with some seeds. So I took up a load of seeds and then brought them back, and that was distributed to schools who used them as a control experiment. Let's see if the seeds in space are different. Do they grow in plants in a different way from the control seeds at home? So nothing absolutely world-shattering, but a really good thing for school students to do. Radio experiments, for instance, so they could students could then track orbits, and there's a lot of maths involved in that. So yes, there were some things, but for British science, sadly, there was not as much as I would have hoped.
I mean, for a space cadet like me, the idea of missing any opportunity at all to go into space is, just unthinkable. But for yourself and Tim Mace, it really was that important that you were not seen merely as space tourists?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, without any shadow of doubt, because we weren't there to do experiments, and I still now believe that if you're going to use all of that resource, it's not just the money, but the fuel, the other people's time. There's so much that's, let's say, that costs in order to get people into space. I think you should make best use of it, and the best use of it is doing good science is doing some research and then disseminating that information when you get back. So I think it's two parts. And even now, the people who go up as tourists, they all want to do experiments. Some description and a combination of experiments, but everybody does something. Even the Japanese person who went before me, who flew as a journalist for Tokyo Broadcasting Service Corporation, he took experiments. So yeah, it's important. Everybody wants to do it. And I think it's what you can show as well. It's what people are really interested in. I think we forget about this. That in the effort to make everything understandable to people who are non-scientists, there's a certain element of perhaps non-scientists themselves who tend to think that that science is not going to be understandable. Therefore, we have to talk about something totally different, like what type of food you might eat. Whereas actually people really are interested if only they can find out. So I would give lots of talks after my space flight about, to start with, about just what it was like being in space. And all the questions at the end were, what was the science? What did you do? Why did the spacecraft do this? What was the material made out of? And why does that react in that way? So yes, so people are just desperate for the information. You know? So yeah, let's do science, and the more science, the better, as far as we're concerned. So yes, absolutely, we would have refused to go.
The flight was finally authorised in January 1991. Is it true that Mikhail Gorbachev actually intervened personally and directed that the flight should go ahead?
I have no idea whether any of these things are really correct. I do know that Margaret Thatcher was very supportive. I certainly spoke to Mikhail Gorbachev from space. It's not the only space mission that he's spoken to, but nonetheless it was not a common thing to happen. So I'll never really know exactly why it was so important, but I think it would have been, I mean, it was certainly sponsored originally. I mean, it's underwritten by the Moscow and Rodney Bank. So there was obviously a large Soviet interest in the fact that the mission should continue. But you know, whose pocket the money came out of and how funds got transferred, and we did the Soviet experiments. So I imagine there was an awful lot of negotiations that took place. But, I mean, I really didn't know it was going to be me flying until about 3 months before. And even then, if I caught a cold on the day of the launch, you know, it would have been Tim, not me.
Helen Sharman would be launched into space on the 18th of May 1991 aboard Soyuz TM-12 with Russian cosmonauts Anatoly Artsebarsky and Sergei Krikalev, the Ozone crew. She would come home 8 days later, with Mir's returning Derbent crew of Viktor Afanasyev and Musa Manarov.
I remember not sleeping an awful lot the night before, so I was obviously fairly excited. And I kept my bedroom windows open, the curtains open, so we could see. I think there was Jupiter was rising on that night, so it was just a really, really gorgeous, clear night. But I don't think we had a very early start. So you could get sort of wiped down in alcohol to sterilise the surface of your skin, so you're not taking as many bugs up there. And you put on sterile underwear, long johns type things, and we had our sort of just normal tracksuity type clothes to start with. But yeah, fairly normal breakfast. Except I do remember some small amount of alcohol, which is a tradition in Russia. Something I can't remember now, but it probably was champagne, the Russian champagne that we had. And the Americans would have sort of thrown up their arms in absolute horror. But yes, it was a small amount, but nonetheless, we drank it, and it's the tradition, and probably Gagarin drank it. And there's one of these many things that, you know, if Gagarin did it, then it's a kind of a tradition that we all try and keep, which is, it's quite nice.
Did the men get out and water the wheel of the bus?
Oh yes, I was allowed special dispensation because I would have had to take my spacesuit completely off to do this. But yeah, so that is, yes, the tradition, because Gagarin did that. Gagarin watched a certain film the night before his launch, so we watched that film. Yes, Gagarin needed to pee on the backside of the bus, so that's what you do. You also take up some this sort of wormwood scrub, which from the steppes of Kazakhstan. It smells strong, with a nice sort of fragrant smell, and you don't get many smells in space. So the idea is that you take that up to remind you of the smell of Earth. So that's another tradition. And the other tradition is, I'm sure this is well now since Gagarin, that you take something for the crew who's already been up there for a while. So you take up something. The idea is you have a sort of a communal mini party on your first night. So you take up something to celebrate that. So, yeah, some clothes or some bit of food that you can manage to muster.
What are your recollections about the launch itself?
A lot of waiting before things could start, so we get strapped into your seat and then you have to wait for the person in the middle to get strapped, the commander to get strapped into his seat. I remember sort of the trivial things, the things like waiting on the steps before we actually got up into the seats, and the waving goodbye to the journalists. Which again just seemed to me to be kind of something we just wanted to get over and done with, really, because we wanted to get on with it. And in many respects, then once you are strapped inside, then you can just get on with the job you've been trained to do. So although there's a little camera on you, it's sort of fairly discreet in the top right of the Soyuz capsule, and you just get on with it, ignoring the fact that people are watching, because it feels just like the simulators, exactly like the simulators. So yes, you just get on. It's about 2.5 hours. You're strapped into your seats before the launch, just going through the bits. And also, there's a lot of waiting. You don't get like 10 minutes at a stretch. You get quite a few seconds, and then a little bit of activity, and then a wait, and then a few more seconds later. So it's not really quite long enough to sit back and think about it, which is perhaps a good thing. But no, I knew that once I decided to go, there was no way I wanted to back out.
Just stepping back a bit. I mean, launching on a shuttle is apparently quite a violent experience. There's like shaking and rocking around and so. What's the experience of a launch on a Soyuz like?
Yeah, it's noisy. Not so much noise from the rocket engine themselves, but noise from all the rattling and shaking. Lots of noise when things like the fairing gets taken away, gets jettisoned once you've come out of the atmosphere. I suppose the thing. Again, you're trained for it, so you know the graph of G versus time as you're supposed to experience it, but it is quite lumpy and bumpy. So not a bit of buffeting as you go through the atmosphere, but even once you're through the atmosphere, you jettison one set of rockets engines, and then the next stage kicks in. So you've got this happening 3 times with 3 different stages, and then the final jettison goes from sort of you feel as though you're being really. I can't remember the final G low, so 3.5 is the maximum, but probably the last stage only takes you up to about 2.5. But still, that's 2.5 times as heavy as you are normally, so you are feeling pretty pushed back into your seat, and then suddenly you're not. Yeah, so suddenly you go from 2.5G to 0G, and you're not floating out of your seat because you're still strapped into it, but your back isn't necessarily really stuck to the back of your seat anymore, and the sweat, I mean, you lose about 1 litre of sweat just during this launch, because your spacesuit's pretty hot, sticky in there, so suddenly you can dry this sweat because you've got the ventilation going through your spacesuit. But I think all of us at that stage, when this G suddenly stopped, instead of straining against it, it's not a huge G, but you strain a little bit. So all of us sort of emitted a kind of an which must have sounded a bit weird to anybody watching, but it was for us it was just quite an involuntary, just suddenly, great, now we're free. It's fabulous. And the sign for the people down on the ground is that we hang a little sort of, I think it was a little model of an astronaut that we'd found actually. We just hang that down so the television camera on it can see this swinging about, and as soon as then the G becomes 0, then this starts to float about, whereas of course because we're still strapped into the seats, the people watching aren't necessarily convinced that we're experiencing 0G as well. One thing that we didn't know about, that an oxygen valve had got opened and stuck open, so we were having more oxygen ingress to the capsule than we should have, so of course too much oxygen, danger of explosions. Fortunately, once we reached the vacuum of space, we think that whatever it was, the bit of dust probably, was sucked out and everything then carried on as normal. Had that not happened, we would have then just come back to Earth on that very next orbit and never made it. We didn't know about that till later. What we did know about were things like we had a manual docking, for instance, so probably during the launch an antenna had become damaged, which meant that instead of having an automatic docking, we had to actually steer the spacecraft, just like a video game, left a bit, right a bit, that kind of thing. But again, each of us operating together as a team, just like we've been trained to do. And you've been there about already 2 days in this small, cramped space, one toilet between the 3 of you, no washing facilities, but you don't mind, I suppose. It's one of those things.
How big an issue was the problem with the Kerr's docking system? Was there a point at which you thought we may not be able to do this and have to abort the mission?
My commander knew that at some point in his mission he would do a manual docking. So, for instance, after I left the space station, what they in the Soyuz craft with the 2 people who had been there before, That meant that it was one Soyuz craft, but it was on the side of the space station that needed to be open for the next supply ship. So they then take off the Soyuz spacecraft and literally fly it around and dock it onto the other end. So he knew that that was something he was going to have to do manually. So all trained up for that. And what we hadn't hoped for was that as a crew we would have to do that on the way to the space station. So I don't remember a few years ago there was a crash where a Progress supply ship was supposed to be going in there automatically but couldn't. They tried to do it manually from the space station but couldn't see it properly and that crashed. So yes, these things they call Neštátní, so they're sort of the unplanned situations, things that you train for but hope never will happen. Still, you know, you do just get on with it. And I have to say, I don't remember being particularly worried. We just got on with it. I had the job of operating a periscopal television camera so that Commander could literally see on a screen where he was going. The engineer fed the information to the Commander, and yeah, bit by bit you sort of get closer and closer. But by that stage, when there's no going back, so I suppose you say, well, either we miss by a mile and then just come back to Earth, or we give this a go.
What were the first few days like on board MIR? Did you get space sick?
No, I think we were lucky because none of us was sick. They try and select people the Russians who are not generally motion sick on Earth. But even then, I think half of all cosmonauts, astronauts, is actually sick in space. So I'm not saying we all felt 100% all the time, but it was. I think you do adapt actually very quickly. So the big thing was going from this tiny cooped up space in the Soyuz spacecraft, which I mean for 2 days, so we're pretty much used to feeling weightless by then. But you open the hatch of the space station and you've got this expanse. I mean, it's very narrow, so you put your arms out sideways and you actually do touch both of the walls, just about. But still, you can stretch out and float down this long expanse. And the doctors were all very concerned that after this sort of, we might be used to feeling weightless in this small, cramped environment, and then when you see this, you know, your eyes focus on this long distance, maybe that was going to make you feel sick all over again. But I have to say, it was just a relief to be there because we'd had this manual docking. We were relieved and delighted to be there in one piece. And of course, the two people who'd been up there for 6 months, I mean, they were really looking forward to us getting there, you know, an extra few people to talk to and to shake hands with and, you know, really have the just normal conversations with. Must have been not very pleasant for them, actually, as they'd realised that actually, you know, the final stage, maybe we weren't ever going to make it. So yeah, so you open the hatch and float inside, and it's the physical stretching out, it's seeing these people, bringing in the bits of things that you've brought up, and we were given time. I mean, the psychologists know that you just need a bit of time to feel at one with this immediately this bigger crew. So then there were 5 of us. So yeah, it was just, I just remember it being just a great and a relief and lovely to just float about and explore for real what I'd seen in the simulators, because they have the simulators set up on Earth, but not necessarily all at the right angles, because of course you're not going to be climbing up into them, so you have to walk through them. But of course you can get to the ceilings much more easily in space, so you can get to all the controls and everything. So it's actually, life in space is easy, I think. It's easier than you would imagine, because you can use all the space, so you think you might feel cramped, but when you realise that you've actually got at least that height again to use, it's really not half as bad as you think. And of course the views out of the windows, we had more windows and bigger windows in the space station, and that's something that nobody ever gets tired of doing.
What was the attitude of the Soviet crew to you? I mean, how did they feel about having a non-Soviet woman on board their space station?
They've always been very welcoming of international cosmonauts, so that's their programme. They know it's been good for their programme, firstly for public relations and with the politics, and then more recently for their economy. So they knew that they were selling a seat really to, whether it was to a government or to a private company. But I mean, I'd made friends already by then, so we were already working quite closely on Earth, and even before the crew launched, 6 months before my launch, so the crew that we met in space. So I'd been to their houses, I'd shared lifts home with their wives, and played with their children, and so you do get to know each other quite well. And they've always been, it's just a nice, friendly atmosphere. I suppose partly because you're all chosen on the same psychological basis, so we tend to be quite similar in characters, I suppose. Fairly stable, not terribly excitable, not terribly depressive. You could argue very boring, very very normal. Just nice, normal people. And it was just nice to be with them again, to catch up with them. I'd got some letters and photographs that I brought up from their families to show them and share with them, and that was nice. But in terms of the gender aspects, typically the Soviets do tend to be a little more, I say, gender aware. And it's only really been the last few decades that we've become better at that, I would say, in the UK. But still, in space, I never felt that there was ever an issue. And on the ground in training, I'd always maintained that, well, when it comes to things like getting changed, I've got my underwear on still, so if I have to change out of my spacesuit in space, I'm not going to have a separate room, so let's just get on with it. And there was no big deal, we did just get on with it. They were fine. But you still have to have this this juxtaposition between, of course, Soviet women engineers, women farm labourers. Of course, have been really valued in the Soviet Union right back from the very early days of communism. So they'd used women, and women scientists was much more accepted in the Soviet Union than they even probably are now in the UK. So in that respect, you've got very pro-women. And on the other side, you've got their gallantry, where a woman will not open a door if there is a man within 100 metres. You must run almost to get to the door before to open the door. Hold your coat for you. And even after I came back from space, I was not able to open a bottle of wine and take the cork out. Somebody else would come. Women don't do that. I'll do that for you. So you go with the culture, really. When in Rome, and I would say argue the same when in Moscow. So you accept the culture within the confines of what you're doing, but it never affected anything in space. So no, I didn't have to do the cooking.
There were reports that Anatoly Artsebarsky wasn't that happy to have Britain's astronaut on board.
Oh, this is one of these many stories that comes back. So he was fine. So he's my commander, and I still am very friendly with him. I've met him again just in Moscow just a few weeks ago. So he's Ukrainian. One of his old friends, I think probably old student friends, maybe even from school, certainly from his homeland, became a journalist. And Tolya would have obviously given him plenty of interviews. Unfortunately, I think the reason this came about was this journalist wanted an interview with Tolya, and at the time Tolya wasn't able to answer the question. So the journalist printed the questions that he thought Tolya would have answered, gave question and answers. And one of these was about, what about working with women? And so he gave a sort of a fairly, like I said, a typical Soviet cultural kind of response, whereas, well, not really sure about it yet kind of thing, which gets then translated and it goes from the Ukrainian into the Russian press. And Tolya didn't want to discredit his friend by saying, my friend printed this and that was did it wrong and he shouldn't have done it. This is really what it is. He explained to me at the time, and I said, look, absolutely fine, no problems. It's in the Ukrainian press, and how naive was I, of course, to believe that that's where it would stay. I wouldn't believe that now, I have to say. But yes, and it gets translated into the Russian press, and it comes over to the UK press, and here I am 20 years later answering quite a reasonable question from you about it. But this is where some of these things come from, and it really. It's sad in many respects that somebody who just makes does something perhaps shouldn't have done at the time, but really it was a non-story. But because we didn't want at the time to just stamp on it and say absolutely not, this person's done a terrible thing, and you think you're going to make a mountain out of a molehill anyway. And for us, it was a molehill. It was no big deal to us because we didn't believe it. So, what was day-to-day life like on board MIR? Every day in space was scheduled by mission control almost by the minute, so supposedly even from waking up, although quite often we'd been awake before we were supposed to be awake. So yes, whether it was an Earth monitoring experiment or a biological experiment with me or with somebody, or on myself or on some of the other cosmonauts, whatever it was scheduled for me, and it would come up in as a fax. So we had this this very long thin reel of paper that would sort of spew itself out of a machine and sort of roll itself round and round and round until we would rip it off and then read out exactly what each of us was supposed to be doing at any particular moment in the day. So yeah, really very, very, very much sort of scheduled and strict, but there was time allowed for breaks, lunch times, meal times, and there was time off in the evenings as well. Not the whole evening, but we'd certainly get a couple of hours quite often where we could just look out of the window, talk, sign things, the usual sort of put the MIR mission stamp on it, so people knew to beam to space, and bring those things back to Earth. So, but by and large, we tended just to like each other's company. It was nice just to talk. I can't even remember a lot of things. It's just chat, but it's just being together. And it's people. Remember the people who've shared some experiences that perhaps not many other people have shared. People who are away from their friends and family, away from a lot of the things that you would normally do. We're away from the. If you think of everything in your house, so we didn't have anything that was personal to us up there, apart from the odd photograph, very small items. I think my personal luggage was reduced to less than 200 grams. But I didn't need anything. My toothbrush was provided for me up there. So you need the bits of privacy, not for yourself, but within yourselves as a team, and those become the conversations that you have. And so I can't remember necessarily all the things that we talked about. We had a small keyboard, so we could play music. We had a guitar. We sang songs, but by and large, we looked out of the window and we just talked.
So the 26th of May, you undock and you leave Anatolia and Sergei on board, and you prepare to come back with Victor and Musa. That must have been quite an emotional moment.
There's always a traditional goodbye sort of handshake and bear hug. So everything's packed. So everything we need to do is already packed in our re-entry spacecraft. So we do the final goodbyes, but it was harder than I had ever anticipated. So we'd been through the docking scenario after the 2 days in Soyuz just together. We'd had this fabulous time on the space station together, and then I was going to leave them behind. And actually, I have to say, tears were shed by more than one of us, me included. We said goodbye, but it's not really a total goodbye, because although you're inside the Soyuz, you're still connected and you can still hear each other. You only really separate once all of you make sure that the seal is properly sealed and all this kind of thing. And then you're still in radio contact anyway. And then when you move further away, you can actually see the space station and you're still in radio contact. So we chatted and chatted and chatted for a long, long time. Then so the radio signal started to break up. And Tolia said, I can't really hear everything now, so I'm just going to play you some music to say goodbye. And I'd taken up with me an very old-fashioned cassette, as they were 20 years ago, just a tape, an old cassette tape. And I just recorded bits of music, things that were either things that I liked, that I knew he liked, and that all the others liked. And we'd played it on and off while we were up there. One of the pieces that he really loved, and he'd always liked when he'd been round to see me in my flat there, was Tanita Tikaram. Now, she's sort of not so popular now as she was, but she'd had a couple of really quite big hits. One was Twist in My Sobriety, and the other one was The World Outside My Window. And Tolia didn't understand much English. He certainly had no idea that these words actually meant, the world outside my window, what they actually meant. But he just liked the sound of her voice. And it was a lovely song. And the whole irony of this is the music that he chose to play. So I remember my last sort of sounds of the space station were Tanita Tikaram's The World Outside My Window, sort of singing to me as we left.
A world outside your window, a world outside your window isn't free. Oh, and tell me if you want to catch that feeling of redemption, that feeling of redemption, don't do much for me.
But yeah, very, very hard actually to say goodbye. Fairly sure that I'd see him again, knowing that the landing is more difficult than the launch, but still, fairly sure we would meet again at some point. But then knowing he was going to be there for another few months, not a happy time to leave them. But then, you've said goodbye and then you're getting on with what you need to do as well. So you don't really realise, I think, what you've left behind until you make it back safely to Earth, and you're back in your bed that night, very normal, realising that actually they're up in their sleeping bags on the space station, like it was for you yesterday, but you're not together anymore. So yeah, you're very hard, but yeah, you say your goodbyes and then get on with the next thing, which was our landing. the landing actually more exciting than the launch. So we always think about the launch because it's the rocket engines and the noise, but you don't see that when you're on Earth watching people come back from space. But having separated from the space station, you then carry on with the orbit until we were over South America, and we knew we had to do our rocket burn over South America. When we start at the right point, then we burn for a certain number of seconds, and that will decelerate us so that we will land in the area where we want to, where the rescue team can come very quickly. And of course, if you get it wrong, you don't burn for long enough, you're not going to land where you want to, or conversely, you burn for too much, you're going to end up in the sea or something. So, so you want to get this right. But of course, as soon as you fire the rocket engines, you're feeling G for the first time in quite a few days. So that, again, we're doing this so that we're pushed back into the seats, so you're always in the most comfortable position to feel it. So you're not got G loads going head to toe. It's always chest to back if you get it right. So that happened, and it's sudden. And then you start to come through the atmosphere, and then of course it's the atmosphere that slows you down itself as well. So you get that deceleration, and then the plasma builds up. So these bits of atmosphere around the spacecraft, they get ionized, they glow, they're very hot, and you start to see this sort of a dull glow, and then it gets brighter and brighter, and it's yellow, and then it's almost white. And you see bits of the spacecraft melting. And of course, you know it's designed to melt. Partly it's this latent heat of melting. It actually takes in heat. And by the fact that it's changing from solid to liquid means that the temperature doesn't go up as much as it might otherwise. So, you know, this is a good thing, you're thinking, as you can sort of see bits of the spacecraft bubbling away and melting. But then quickly the window's just covered in soot, and you don't see out of the window then again. Until you're dragged out of the spacecraft. But yeah, that decelerates you. And what I suppose what I found quite shocking, really, I was expecting it, but still not really knowing how it was going to feel, was when the parachutes came out. They come out of one side of the spacecraft, and until the actual wire then sort of comes all the way round the rim, you're left sort of dangling on one, sort of swung to one side. So you have the jerk, and then you swing violently sort of backwards, side to side a few times. So there's a drogue chute, and then we had two other parachutes that come open. If you open one chute straight away, then that will just get ripped up by the atmosphere. You need to slow down first. Yeah, and then then you're just gliding down, and then 1.5 meters above the ground retro rockets fire. So again, you feel that. But it was windy, so instead of coming down straight, we were coming down at an angle, if you can imagine being sort of blown along with the parachutes. So when the retro rockets fired, they fired at an angle and then tumbled us over, head over heels. And we ended up on our sides. I can't remember how many times we tumbled over, but I do remember that, because I was strapped into my seat, so that's fine. But what you're not done is the head isn't strapped to the back of the helmet. So my head could come forward, and actually we all did. We bashed our faces on the front of the helmet. So I had I think Russian, it's the shlemophone, the bits that you speak into, the microphones essentially as part of the head cap. So those were pushed into our mouths. So the only injuries we had was some sort of mild bruising to the inside of our mouths, really, where we sort of smacked our faces into the front of the helmet. But yeah, we ended up on our sides. I ended up on the top, luckily. Poor Musa Munarov, he was the engineer, he ended up on the bottom. And we brought back quite a bit of stuff. Some stuff which we'd managed to actually put behind us and secure properly. Some other stuff that we'd got that was allowed to bring back officially. So for instance, our books, our manuals, and some other bits and pieces that we were a bit naughtily just bringing back and holding on to. Well, by the time we tumbled over head over heels, all that was dropped onto the poor engineer. So I remember sort of sitting, we'd stopped tumbling, and we kind of, can't remember who said it first, but we kind of, you okay? Yep. Okay, you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. And then I looked down, and all I could see was this poor engineer trying to sort of fight off all of these bits and pieces that had dropped on top of him. But then we knew that the rescue team had seen us, and we just had to wait. It was about 20 minutes. And they decided they were going to upright the spacecraft first before they dragged us out. So we just had to wait until that happened. Yeah, and then one by one they dragged us out. They pulled out the commander first, because he's actually in the middle seat and nobody can get past him. Then there was the engineer next, because he'd been up there much longer than I had, and it was quite obvious that they need to get these people out and look after them, whereas somebody who's only been up for a few days is going to be able to sort of take these things much more easily. So then I was finally pulled out, and I remember just sort of sitting on top of the spacecraft and just looking around, and I don't know quite what I'd expected. I hadn't really, I suppose what I'd been trained right up to that moment. But then thereafter, they knew that they were going to be looking after me, unless I needed to sort of to look after myself because there was some problem on landing. But in terms of this normal situation, I hadn't really thought then what was I going to do, because other people were just going to look after me. And I remember just sitting around there thinking, all these people, you know, there are just the three of us, and we were looking after ourselves in space, and suddenly there's all these people coming, and there were people taking photographs, and there were the doctors, and there were people, the engineers dragging us out, and the people in the helicopters, and there was a tent. So in the middle of the Kazakh steppe, they'd set up this huge tent, and of course it seemed so almost like a building. I a bit naively expected it to have like facilities, so I was thinking, great, okay, so I've been in my spacesuit now for a while. I haven't drunk much because I knew I wasn't going to be able to use a toilet on the landing, but I could, you know, I'm getting like I could quite use the loo, so that'll be fine. So they then let us sort of slide down the side of this of the spacecraft into seats, and then the doctors are taking blood pressures, and they're saying, do you want a cup of tea? And I'm thinking, yeah, a bit hot and sweaty in the spacesuit. You know, end of May, Kazakh steppes, could do with taking off the spacesuit and getting very hot, getting very, you know, very red. And they say, oh, you look really healthy. Yeah, it's because I'm just hot. Just get me to take this spacesuit off, and actually, you know, just let me go to the loo. And so finally we're out away from these things. They'd done the tests, they'd done the interviews that they needed to do, and the medical interviews is what I mean, as well as I think it was a few journalists were allowed access. And then off I went into this tent. I'm like, great, okay, spacesuit needs to come off quickly because I'm really, really hot. And they're saying, okay, now we've got to do things very slowly and carefully. And I think, look, I've just got to get this spacesuit off. And there's a picture of me that the British doctor took where they've got these great big fans that they'd set up. So there must have been some sort of generator that they'd taken with them as well. I mean, huge facilities, really. So I'm opening this great big hole in the middle of my spacesuit. That's how you climb into it. And they've just got the fan. So I've just got this fan going through to cool me off a bit. Take the spacesuit off, and I'm just saying, look, where's the toilet? And they say, there isn't a toilet. And there must be a toilet. I need to use the toilet. There isn't a toilet. Well, but if I haven't been to the toilet for a long time, I need to use the toilet. Well, there's a bucket. Right, okay, just give me a bucket. And so that's all really, that's the first thing I really needed to do, with having literally relieve myself. I needed to pee. So once I'd been to the loo, then I could relax a little bit more, and thereafter, all I remember is just putting on the same clothes that I'd taken off before I put my spacesuit on before, and I needed some support, somebody on either arms, because I was actually a bit wobbly, because while physically I was still quite strong. I mean, 8 days in space isn't long enough for the muscles to deteriorate. The vestibular system, your balance system, is really quite confused, and it has to get used to feeling up and down again. So even just standing still, I was aware I was a little wobbly, and actually then lifting up my leg, I mean, my leg felt so incredibly heavy. Everything feels heavy. As soon as you land, even just lifting up your little finger, you feel the weight of that. Very quickly you get used to it, but still, my leg felt heavy, and I felt as though I was had to lean over because I was pulling up this huge weight of a leg, and of course you don't normally do that when you walk, and so I was sort of a bit wobbly. But after a few paces, you know, you adapt so quickly. And there I was then, you know, using gravity, eating a muesli bar and shaking the crumbs out, and I remember thinking, yeah, I couldn't do that a few hours ago. I couldn't shake crumbs out of this kind of packet, and now I'm just naturally using gravity because you go with what it feels like, which is why we can't imagine feeling weightless until you're actually there. Although I have to say, I do still dream about it sometimes.
That's fascinating. So 20 years after the mission, you still dream about being on board MIR?
Like, not often. I mean, I don't often remember my dreams. I sleep fairly heavily, fairly deeply. But yes, sometimes I dream about floating, actually just floating through the spacecraft, stopping by the window, looking out, having a chat to some people. They're the people who I was with, and then floating on past again. And that feeling in my dream is as it was in space still.
There have been other British-born astronauts. I mean, Michael Foale has dual citizenship because his mother's an American. Piers Sellers and Nicholas Patrick took American citizenship to fly on board shuttle. But so far you are the only purely passport-carrying British astronaut. What does that say to us about Britain's attitude to space, really?
I think it shows how short-termist we've become. We did have an astronaut program. This was back in the 1980s. We had 4 military people training with NASA. One would have flown on a shuttle, but then the Challenger accident happened. All the foreigners were told to go away, back to their countries, and come back once the shuttle program was restarted. And in that time, our government decided, don't want to do this anymore. The cost on the bottom line is very expensive, and what are our returns? Now, I think everybody recognises that there are returns on science that you do, and those returns are a variety of short and long term. Space travel for humans in space, the return is long term. It's certainly longer than a government's term in office, and I think the fact that we've not had anybody training since that time, as you know, sponsored by as a state astronaut, is very sad. It shows how short-termist that attitude is, and it's just such a shame in that Britain used to be at the forefront of, you know, the Victorian engineering, and we still are at the forefront in many respects of science. I mean, look at what we do if we do fund things like research into, let's say, graphene now. Great, we're all jumping on the bandwagon of graphene. Nothing against graphene, it's great, and in fact, in my job now, graphene is, you know, very important. But there are things that we do need to fund that are going to give us benefit in that longer term. It's not just about doing those experiments in space, that's part of it. It's not just about Britain having money coming back in from the space programs to our, let's say, our space companies, people who actually build satellites, build other space hardware, build the infrastructure for people going into space. But there's so much more as well. It's about that national pride. You know, we used to be the best in the world at a lot of things. We're not so much anymore. We're now starting to take more and more a back seat. Britain's the poor country. Oh, Britain isn't funding that. We're out of Europe, really. And I think British people are feeling more and more sort of, we're just left in the sidelines. We're left in the wings. We're not really taking part in this world stage. And that could turn around so quickly. So we could get national pride. We would have so much more interest suddenly engendered by an event of having a British astronaut. And you don't have to have somebody flying very often. You just need to have Britain involved in this space programme. Look what's happening with the Olympics. Look how much hype is being made and how much is being made about this nationalism. And yet, how many people really are going to benefit from that in the long-term future? Yes, it's great to get Britain fit. It's also great to get Britain educated and realising that science is going to be something that not only is useful for us, but we need to have this open public dialogue so that we can properly debate the benefits, the pros and the cons of all sorts of issues, whether it's genetic engineering, whether it's whatever it's going to be. These things need to be debated because it's not just scientists who decide what goes on. Scientists are there to do their research, but it's the nation as en masse that needs this public debate to then enable the politicians to decide where we're going to go ahead. Yeah, we need another astronaut.
Britain aside, I mean, do you feel optimistic about human spaceflight generally?
Human spaceflight, I mean, will without a doubt continue. Look what's happening at the moment. China is putting a huge amount of money in investment in science across the board, including space travel. And if nothing else, that's going to awaken some nationalistic rivalry. The Americans are going to be worried about that. The Russians have helped the Chinese quite a lot, and no doubt are working together very much with them economically as well. To get this space program happening for the Chinese. But yeah, it's going to happen. We're going to have people on Mars without a doubt, and it's just a question of humans have always pushed forward. We've always explored, and we recognise that in the very long term we need space for our existence. In between that, that is, we're talking many years hence, but in the interim, we know that we do need to continue pushing forward and exploring further and further. And we'll do that with satellites. quite rightly, remotely, but we also need to do that with people. And having people existing in space and going that bit further and visiting other planets and comets, and maybe even setting up factories on them, mining things. You know, that's all something that we need to do just as a normal part of human development.
Juno was obviously a major part of your life. What's your career path been since then?
Wow, 20 years ago. So 20 years ago I flew into space, came back. What I really wanted to do was to disseminate to people generally in this country information about my space flight, because I felt as though perhaps they'd only got some part of the message and there was so much more that people would like to know. I did made a lot of talks about my space flight. It became very obvious in those talks how interested people were in the real science, not just the experiments that I did, but the science and the technology, engineering even, of spacecraft systems. And that made me realise how inaccessible a lot of information about science was. So I then started to work more generally in the public understanding of science arena. I became self-employed. I worked with many different organisations, a lot of universities, a lot of industrial organisations, just enabling people to have access, whether it was asking questions of industry about what they're doing and why, whether it's coming to an exhibition or giving a lecture on, I gave lectures on glass, all sorts of really interesting things for me because I was learning new things as well. And people were fascinated by these things, and I enjoyed very much that communication aspect. But I have to say, after I'd done that for a few years, I needed a change because a lot of it was based on my space flight. And while I'm sure if you're listening to it for the first time, it's one thing. For me, I was talking about something that was becoming more and more historic and more repetitive, and I just really needed to do something different. So although I don't talk about my private life in terms of my family and friends, some of the things that I did, so for instance, I decided at some point that I needed to make a change. And I did a master's degree in Central and Southeast European Studies because I was really interested in linguistics and the linguistics, the languages in the Balkans and how they're changing. That really fascinated me, and Balkans became very topical in the early 90s as well. So that was an interest. Now I'm working at the National Physical Laboratory, so I'm back in a team of people, and that's what I recognised as well as what I missed working on my own, was that I missed the team relationships, the work relationships that you get when you get to know people relatively well. You can come in and ask them, what was the film like last night? How's your family? That kind of ongoing relationship I find I actually need. And I love working in a team. So I'm a group leader. I've got 20 scientists, but we've got many people in NPL, and we work making measurements for UK industry. My group does a lot of research. I don't understand all the things they do. The scientists do the research, and I really sort of look after them and enable them to do that. But I really do love just being back as part of a team once again.
Last question. What did Juno mean to you?
Juno to me was the ability to go into space, to experience weightlessness, to enjoy that real strong team spirit that I had with my crewmates, and to do things that I just could not do on Earth, the experiments, the looking out of the window. It changed my life.
A world outside your window. A world outside your window isn't free. Oh, and tell me if you want to catch that feeling of redemption. That feeling of redemption. Don't do much for me.